Our contact with patients was at the end of the first year. I think we'd been in physiotherapy school for about 7 or 8 months, and I remember going to Mrs. Ingall's and in the medical outpatients, and I had to put a shortwave machine on a patient with an OA knee. I'm sure that the lady was very kind and understanding, but I'm sure we were pretty useless after only about 8 or 9 months of teaching. We didn't have too many clues. In those days, when you're working on the wards or in the outpatient department, we had these dreadful white starched uniforms, and as a first year physiotherapy student, you didn't have any epaulets on your shoulders. It was a very hierarchical way of looking at things in those days, and as a second year student you wore just plain epaulets, and there were no third year students because you always went away as a third year, and then staff had 1 stripe or 2 stripe or 3 stripes, and Billy McLeod was the principal, and she looked like an admiral with her gold stripes on her shoulders. She also wore a white starched uniform, but it had pleats down the front, and it was obviously custom made, and she strutted around the School of Physiotherapy with her white uniform and her epaulets, as did the other staff when they were in that sort of uniform. These uniforms had these dreadful buttons that we had to put on every time we had a new uniform, and in those days we wore stockings. They used to catch on your stockings, and of course, if your uniform was the slightest bit tight, and your buttons could pop out, and that could be quite embarrassing too. We used to have to go over to the hospital uniform pool to get these dreadful white uniforms, and when they were first on, they were starch and crisp, but they very quickly became limp and horrible. Then as second year students, we would have lectures in the morning and work in the afternoon as in whatever department you were, whether it was outpatients or in the wards. And as second year students, we used to wear epaulets, and of course brown stockings and regulation brown shoes, and your hair had to be up, or it wasn't meant to be on your collar, although of course that was always a bone of contention when who said it was on your collar or who wasn't. It was pretty strictly run, a bit like a boarding school at times. Roll calls were taken at all lectures, and you had to be at your lectures, and I do appreciate the reason for that, because you had to complete so many thousand hours in each topic. Coming back to the first year, I recall a lot of the students, fellow students, were staying in the nurses' home at Whakaari Hospital. Whakaari Hospital, of course, is way up in the hills, and you had to come down these very, very steep hills, and in the winter time there was often ice on them, or if there was snow, often you couldn't get down. They would come down by bus, although a couple of the students had scooters, Vespa scooters, and they would sometimes in the winter time, those on Vespa scooters sometimes had accidents on the ice on the hills. They were invariably arrived late for our 8 o'clock lectures, because you can imagine it was quite dark when they would have to leave, and it was pretty icy and pretty slippery. On those days also, the buses, there were trolley buses running up and down those hills, and the trolley buses often couldn't get down the hills because of the ice or the snow. I was private boarding very, very close to the medical school, within 5 minutes walking, with another friend of mine who was doing physiotherapy. So it was very easy for us to get to lectures for 8 o'clock. But on a cold winter's morning, it was pretty miserable. And obviously that's when the lecture theatres were free from the medical students, because all our lectures were in the medical school. We started off with a class of 60. About 12 failed the first year, and about 6 of those didn't return, and 6 carried on. They had to repeat their first year. In our second year, so the second year was always smaller, although it did have some people who were repeating, and by the end of the second year the class was around about 50. And then of course there's always people who failed second year and had to repeat second year. And then in our third year we went on to the various schools throughout New Zealand. There was a school in Christchurch, Wellington, Hamilton and Auckland. I went to the Christchurch school because I was brought up in Timaru, and we were looked after very, very well there and treated like staff members. And we had a tutor who I can't remember her name at this point, but she smoked like a train, and she smoked cigarillos, and I have a very strong memories of, as she's working with you, the smell of cigarillos. Yuck. Enough to put anybody off smoking forever. And she had a bad cough, and I later heard she had died of lung cancer. What a surprise. Our third year in Christchurch, we rotated through all the wards and through the various hospitals. It was at Christchurch Public Hospital, Princess Margaret Hospital, and Burwood, which is where plastic surgery was. And there were some geriatrics out at Burwood Hospital. And of course there was outpatient department. One of the strong memories I have of outpatient was there was a lot of ultraviolet done in those days, and there was this tiny little room where all the ultraviolet was done, where they had a theractin, and we had lots of patients with psoriasis come through. And we also did a lot of work with the Cromire, with bed sores and ulcers. We'd also do a lot of massage for ulcers. For varicose ulcers, you'd usually do a Cromire treatment for the ulcer, and then you would follow it with massage, and then you would bandage with the very thick bandage, blue line bandages for massage for varicose ulcers. In our third year we had to do a research project, nothing like the research projects that are expected of students nowadays, but you had to take a topic and look at it in depth. No such things as lit searches in those days. The research topic that I chose was ultrasound, and I actually went back through all the records for a couple of years at Christchurch Public Hospital and looked at the outcomes of each of these ultrasound treatments, how many treatments they had, what was it given for, and that was my research project. So it was my first taste of research. I'll put that in quotation marks, research. But the person who won the prize there was always a prize for the best research project, and the person who done it had done a very elaborate description on hallux valgus, which was a very common condition, and we often did physiotherapy for hallux valgus. Either we did thoracic baths in those days, pretty horrible things to do. We had to experience it, of course, ourselves, which I never liked, the feeling of Faradism on your feet. And so thoracic baths to get the intrinsic muscles going of the foot, and then they had exercises for the intrinsic muscles. We had a spinal unit in Christchurch, and I can remember really enjoying working in the spinal unit there. And perhaps it was the one area where I felt very much part of the team. Physios were an integral part of that team right from very early on. And I suppose I was also impressed as a young, by the stage I would have been 19, coming up 20. I was very impressed by these young people who had these dreadful spinal injuries, who ended up being quadriplegics or paraplegics, but how much you were appreciated, and working closely with the specialist, who I think he was a urologist, but I'm not quite sure that I have vague, because it's a long time ago, I have vague memories about that.